Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luke Gebhardt, a senior project manager with Milepost Consulting. My colleague, Virginia Berry, and I are excited and honored to be the meeting facilitator for the Mayor's Climate Council Transportation Meeting. Without further ado, I'm going to kick it off to Mayor Kincannon to welcome us all. Mayor?
Thank you very much. Welcome. Oh, thank you for changing the view. I think I can, it's really nice to be able to see some people's faces. Go ahead and undo, show us your faces if you don't mind. It helps, I think. So hello, everybody. This is the second meeting of the Mayor's Climate Council. Today's topic is transportation issues and also introducing the equity working group. I'm really committed to the work of this council and grateful for all the work that you guys have put in already. I'm also grateful to have Brian Blackman leading the effort on the city's behalf, and he's doing a great job, as is our whole sustainability department. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation today. I would say I'm keen on all these topics, but the transportation discussion is something that I have more personal experience with, just because we all get around in our personal lives as well as professional lives. So I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion and working to make Knoxville a more sustainable city, a more multimodal city, and a city where we can, help reach our sustainability goals in the transportation sector as well. So thank you for being here. And Luke, I'll kick it back to you for the rest of our discussion.
Thank you, Mayor. Going to kick it over to Brian to help set the table for today's discussion. Brian?
Great. Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Mayor. And thanks to Grace Levine, our sustainability coordinator, who's manning the chat, making sure everybody gets in their proper homes and on the panelist list and doing all the hard work of setting up the recordings. So I just want to take a couple minutes to introduce myself again. So for those of you just tuning in for the first time online, I'm Brian Blackman. I'm the Sustainability Director, and I'm happy to be here today. Today is actually my official work anniversary. I'm 6 years on the job today. My first day back in 2014, we had a public meeting that night for urban agriculture zoning at the Chancellor Y. And that was my first introduction to a city-led public process and trying to drive change here in Knoxville. And I think that was a huge success. And I think this is another success that we're setting up here today. To take a right turn off memory lane, I wanted to start with a little bit of a recap of the process of what our team's been working on the past 2 months. And the flow that's coming up on your screen might look familiar. I first introduced this at the meeting back in May. And it's been, sorry, we've got a little bit of an echo here. It's been 2 months, so I wanted to center us in this process and find out and let you all know where we're at, how we're working, what our team's been working on in the past 2 months. I put the super handy label there of "We are here" at that second block in the process. Essentially, we started that first May meeting. We sent you all some surveys, and we've been chewing on the results of those surveys and forming the working groups. So there's obviously multiple components to this process, and it gets very complicated, but we've got 4 working groups in addition to the 15-person council. So there's a lot of conversations that are happening, and they're happening in between these main meetings, these bi-monthly meetings over the next 9 months. But at the beginning of all these meetings, we're going to provide an opportunity to give an update. So this month, you're hearing from me. In subsequent months, you'll be hearing working group report outs. We do have a report out from the equity working group after me today, but this would be part of the cyclical nature of this conversation and how we revisit these topics and stay in touch. For some of the illustrative qualities of just comparison, if you think of this 15-person council, you guys are the board of directors. the working groups are the staff. You're steering the process, you're providing the vision, you're providing expertise in your own way, but the working group level folks are the real technical experts and practitioners that we're bringing in to help put some meat on the bones of the impact whenever we start talking about that. If you're looking at this past 2 months, really, you all completed a survey, and we had, I think, 100% completion across or if not, maybe one person might have done a partial completion, I think. I'm looking at my survey results, but we had overwhelming completion on the survey results. We took those results and conducted essentially a baseline for where we're at in this process. What's the perceived importance of these various approaches that we're discussing, the strategies that we introduced? How do our local practitioners start to feel about that? And so we took your input in that survey and we put it into action. Next slide, Luke. We used your baseline survey and results. We used our existing contact list, and we started to assemble working groups to tackle equity, energy waste, and what we're here to discuss today, transportation. So based off how the council prioritized and questioned topics, in your write-in sections and your free flow blank, open-ended section at the end, we started developing experts to address those concerns and also provide insights on those topics. And I really see this survey as an iterative one. We started with a baseline because we needed somewhere to get started, but to the right-hand column, this is not a final ranking. This is not a commitment to specific language as is put into the strategies, and it's not a substitute for in-depth discussion. We use this as a launching off point. So we'll continue to develop this in home language over the working group discussions, over our conversations today. We took all those working groups, members that we've identified, suggestions from you all, suggestions from our contact list, and we also surveyed them. And we took that same input, we combined the results of the prioritization survey with their area of expertise and your overall rankings. And we then took that same information to feed back into the iterative loop, and we said, are we missing more people? And so we actively went back and tried to find additional potential blind spots where maybe we don't feel like we've got someone that can speak to a certain topic. And while you'll see some names on these lists, we've got the working groups posted on the Climate Council website, which is knoxvilletn.gov/climate council. Those names will change. They'll grow. There'll be more people that'll be involved in that process. Don't get fixated on whether or not there's a certain checkbox that's missing. Feel free to bring it up to staff, and we'll try to find an expert if you don't feel like we've got it reflected there. Luke, could you go to slide 3? So here is the approximate ranking of those baseline strategies. And the color coding does mean something. And the green one at the top, those two strategies, there was overwhelming consensus of priority. Everyone seemed to value those two things without question, and that is improve bicycle and pedestrian facilities and make public transit investments that significantly enhance the coverage, service quality, frequency, and or speed. So a lot of the comments that we got were that we need to define those more. The language is very generic across all of these, which we knew starting out. And that's where the working groups will come in to kind of hone that. The next group, those 4 in the middle that are highlighted yellowish, those still scored very highly, but there was a lot more healthy debate around those. So we started to see people cast votes that said slightly important or not important in that middle section. But there wasn't too much debate that there was with a refinement that those could be good initiatives to pursue. And then that final group, the orange, those were the lowest scored solutions. So whenever you're thinking about these groupings from those first 2 to the second grouping, there was roughly a 6-point difference between those and the weighted scoring that we came up with. From the second group to the final group, there was a 10-point delta. So it was a big drop off between the importance of that second grouping of 4 and the final 3. But there's a lot more important perspectives to be fleshed out in this process. So I want to give you just a quick glance at how the voting came in, and if we could advance the slide, Luke. I'll share all this as a follow-up to all so you can kind of digest. The bar graphs that you're looking at, those are the strategies. They're listed in the order that they were ranked. And that's a relative percentage of the votes that came in for each category. So the blue being not important, all the way up to orange being very important. You can see those top two, the very little question. They were all moderately important to very important, overwhelmingly in the important to very important categories. And you start to see a lot more debate and disagreement the further you go down. Between the two groups, because we did survey the technical experts that we invited, as well as the Climate Council, which represent, I would say, a much more general knowledge of across all sectors. The scoring was pretty close. The only difference really was that the technical groups typically weighted things a little bit more conservatively, and that was exacerbated the lower the strategy was on the list. So you started to see a lot more not important votes, which we would expect because they have a lot more insight and technical knowledge of the effectiveness. And I think you all were getting to that in your votes and your natural lower rankings of those. And that just was compounded and even more starkly when compared to the technical group. Only 4 categories received not important votes, and those not important votes were generally in the overall minority. Most of those that had a not important vote had some sort of stipulation. I wouldn't say that they were overwhelmingly negative or that people felt that they were a waste of time, so much as I would say that people's comments on those reflected the need for greater clarity. Either it was too generic or people felt like it might be a waste of time. We can dive into that a little bit more over time. There were very few that were an outright waste of time. Autonomous vehicles particular is what I'm referencing when I say this, that most people that voted that so lowly felt like it was so far off from a practical reality that their vote reflected that we shouldn't discuss it right now. I don't know that anyone felt like it's not something that should be discussed, just that relative low importance of trying to spend too much time on it right now. Let's see. And again, these scores are not a replacement for discussion. We're going to discuss your reactions to these today, capture those. We're going to carry that conversation and discuss the actual mitigation impacts and relative cost in working group discussions. So we will continue to explore these. And this is not a final ranking. This is not a final language. We didn't have any unique write-ins either. There were lots of variations on the existing strategies, and I think that those are probably best put in a parking lot and addressed through working group discussion at a later date rather than trying to come up with several permutations that people rank at this stage. Like if you could advance me to my last slide. So I want to thank everyone that's participated so far. Special thank you to the Transportation Working Group and the Equity Working Group, because we had to organize them and get their panels put together in a relatively short time frame. They had to do their interviews, the surveys, learn about the Climate Council within one meeting, and try to put together a panel that would cater to this. So we've spent a lot of time with them over the past month especially. And the Equity Working Group has already met, and you'll hear from report out from them shortly. But every working group we've had some contact with. We've already talked with the energy group and the waste group, and we've got those initial members listed up. So we appreciate their time. And up next is 3 Cubed, who's going to talk a little bit about the facilitation and discussion that's going through with the Equity Working Group right now. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Brian and Luke. And looking at this cover slide, which I didn't create, but it's awesome. So thanks for that. And so again, my name is Erin Rose. I'm with 3 Cubed, which is a local research nonprofit. And amazingly, I was afforded the incredible opportunity to facilitate this quite magical equity working group. I mean, seriously, the membership is amazing. And the breadth and depth of knowledge and expertise that they bring to the table across a number of sectors really is, I think, one of the most valuable pieces of this process. So this is my voice. I'm starting off with my voice and my ask, which is for you all to really think about what this process would look like in the absence of the equity working group members and the tasks that they have been set out to do in grounding your work in equity and really ensuring that at the end of the day, what is achieved is something that really resembles a system where everyone gets to share in opportunities and benefits from climate mitigation strategies. So that's my ask. And so hopefully for this presentation, you'll hear more of the voice of the group members themselves coming through. So if you want to advance the slide. And I have about 7 to 10 minutes, and at the end, and I know that Stan had trouble getting into the Zoom, so hopefully he's in now. But I'd like to make sure that he has an opportunity, since Stan is both on the Climate Council and in this equity working group. I'd love for him to have an opportunity to either add to or correct me or underscore a particular point that's super important. So again, like Brian said, we have had an opportunity to meet collectively just once. So our overview will be mostly general in terms, but I have had the awesome opportunity to communicate one-on-one with each of the equity group members and really get to learn more about them and their life's work. And really what is really going to stand out as important through this process, what matters. And that's something as a social scientist I always think about is, okay, well, why does this matter? Why is this important within the context of whatever we're talking about? And today we're talking about climate change. So in thinking about how to meaningfully integrate equity into climate action, it became more and more important, or the people were expressing more and more the importance of integrating equity into every stage of this process. So even though for this phase with you all, we're really thinking about the identification of solutions and the designing of those solutions more, fleshing them out, and really thinking about how do you decide which solutions are the best. So that's this phase, but it became really clear that equity will need to feature in the follow-up stages through the implementation strategies, their monitoring and evaluation, accountability, and really in outcomes themselves. So in looking ahead, you can see how thinking about what those outcomes, anticipating those outcomes in advance is really important. And you can really start to think about them from a systems thinking perspective and anticipate what they might be. But unless you're actually also monitoring them in real time through their implementation, then have you really integrated equity throughout the climate action process? So that's something, and I just want to be super transparent about what is coming out of this group and what is on their minds in terms of what makes their work in this process meaningful to them. So in order to take all of these process points from the left column and thinking about the tasks that this group has really set out to do in the right column, what is it that we're actually going to do? And the first step in thinking about participation and decision-making is really engaging the frontline communities, and frontline communities can be defined as those that will likely bear the most burden from climate change. And there's more to that definition, but we'll keep it simple and we'll keep it there. And then really thinking about the communication and really thinking about the equity working group members as bridges to the technical subcommittees and to the overarching council in sharing the experiences, the lived experiences of those frontline communities, also marginalized groups that really must have a voice in the design process and in the decision-making process for this to really stay grounded in equity. I think it will also be important in our feedback to the technical subcommittees on the strategies that they're presenting to us, and in our screening process and screening those for equity, to continuously engage with those communities throughout the process, so that you really are thinking about not just participation, but parity in participation, meaningful, authentic participation with these groups. One of the other things that's a primary concern, I just want to underscore for this slide, is the power in decision making. And how does the equity working groups feedback feature in that decision making process? How is that power shared between the working groups and the council, so that at the end of the day, the work that the equity working group is putting into this is heard. So if you want to advance this slide. Thank you. So in my facilitator brain, I really started to think about this in terms of, how would we start this process? What frameworks should we be, working within? There's a couple of really fantastic frameworks for, thinking about justice and equity in terms of what questions, overarching questions should be asked, and goal setting. However, it became, again, really clear through this organic process that people were really wanting to express where they're at and what matters to them right now, today. And so thinking about in my role, I did my best to organize a lot of those thoughts into these 5 overarching dimensions of equity, or themes, if you will. So, right, easy, right? You have all these really super comprehensive, understandable issues that we're going to try to deal with. So if you want to advance the next slide, to the next slide. So I think one of the real challenges for screening for equity within the context of climate change is that there are a number of components or elements within these broader dimensions where we find inequities. And so we're not starting from an equal place. We're starting from a place where we have historic inequities that have persisted over time. And so thinking about the strategies that are coming out, it can be a little bit overwhelming in, how do we anticipate impacts on all of these various components. And I don't think it's realistic for us to think that we can do all of this. And in no way does anyone on the equity working group think that climate mitigation strategies can solve all of these complex social problems. So I just want to allay that fear right now, that we're not thinking we can solve all these problems, but the issue that we're finding is that in order for us to really have access to a quality life of dignity, these are the components that we need to address. And if a particular strategy coming out of a technical subcommittee is anticipated to either impede progress in one of these areas or significantly benefit one of these components, then we should be able to anticipate that. We should be able to screen for that and determine at what impact level that might occur. And that's our job, is to really think about this super comprehensively. Challenge is that these components and these elements are part of the system. They might be bulleted here and listed here, but they are indivisible, they are interactive, they are interrelated. So when you impact one of these particular components, you can be guaranteed that it's going to impact another component, both positively and negatively. And so tracking, and really, again, thinking about it in terms of a systems theory, thinking approach, you can start to anticipate the multiple impacts, both direct and indirect. So for example, if you were to, and I'm sure everybody could do this, you could just sort of start plucking out these things and think about how they might be interactive. So if you were to think about it in terms of improving the environment for children in under-resourced communities in Knoxville, and you created more healthy living environments, what might that do to their educational outcomes, to their capability to show up ready to learn in the school setting? And if you have improved educational outcomes, you're guaranteed to have improved economic outcomes. I mean, that's the science. That's what the science tells us. If you have improved economic outcomes, then you're really opening up access to innovations and really being part of being able to participate in a just transition to a low carbon economy. And so that's just one example of a positive benefit. And I think that in terms of the screening these strategies for negative or adverse impacts, it's going to be really important to think about those areas that are most challenging to us today, which are those areas where we see significant gaps between groups. So if there was a strategy that we felt could impede progress for dealing with racial health inequities, disparities in other areas where those gaps really persist, then that would be something that would come out of our screening process and in our feedback back to the technical subcommittee. So again, this isn't meant to be super overwhelming, and I don't want you to think that we are trying to solve all of the world's problems through this one project. But I think it is time that we really think comprehensively about all the potential impacts from our actions. So if you want to advance the slide.
Yeah, and Erin, I hate to break your stride, but we are nearing time for this section.
Oh, good. Okay. So this is the last slide, and it's just a list of our next steps. And sorry, I didn't have a time. I should have started my time. I apologize.
That's okay.
So we do have a lot of work set out for us moving forward, and really kind of going back to the fundamental, what we need to do to set up our work and our screening mechanisms, our criteria, developing criteria from the list that we just presented in terms of all the various areas of equity, components of equity, and through that criteria and scoring approach, we aim to judge the proposed climate strategies coming out of the technical subcommittees, and we'll provide feedback on those strategies. And we'll also hopefully help the city in its later on in the process in anticipating unintended consequences during the implementation stages and identifying indicators and signals that might help us understand where we're going wrong and where there could be harm. So that's all I have. And so I apologize for going over time, but I don't know, Brian, do we have any time for questions or for Stan to chime in?
Yeah, maybe time for one question. Sorry, Brian, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's okay. I was just saying I'm scrolling through the chat list and I don't see Stan in there. We do have an email out to him to hopefully work through his issue, but we haven't heard back.
If you want to get Stan, text the information to him rather than email it, he'll more likely respond.
We'll continue to try to get Stan in the meeting. Is there potentially one question for Erin around transportation specific equity? And yes, we've reached out to Stan. We've tried to get him in the meeting. We'll continue to do so.
I'll just say thank you, Erin Rose, for facilitating this and for the committee members for really digging into a tough topic. I think it's really important that we add this lens. This is something that we haven't through a planning process in the city. When we did this back in 2008, we didn't have this lens, and I think it's really important as we do this now that we do. And so thank you for the work of your staff and your team in digging in and really trying to help us advise and get this right from the beginning. So thanks.
And if there are no questions, and I'm not cutting into too much time, this was something that was demanded from the community. So we're happy to include it, and we're looking forward to hearing their feedback.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Aaron Rose and Aaron Gill. We will move into the panel presentation part of today's meeting. We've got 3 different topics: alternative fuels, transit and transportation demand management, and bike pedestrian safety. Each of our presenters, again, as a reminder, you all have about 3 minutes, and we will be watching the clock for this. And without further ado, we will bring up the alternative fuels panel. And I see Kent, he is front and center on my Zoom list.
Okay.
So Kent Manault with the Sierra Club, you have the mic.
All right, I'll take it away. Thanks. Great to be here with everybody. I'm Kent Manault with the Sierra Club. I'm going to talk about best practices around EV adoption, and I'll be fast. Do you have my first slide up there?
I do, yeah. Charge Up LA.
Yeah, that's it. Great, great.
Okay.
Now, best practices around EV adoption are pretty easy to categorize. There are incentives, there is infrastructure, and it's easy to see why. EVs are way more economical than gas guzzlers, but the initial cost is higher. And who's going to get one if they can't see a way to charge it up? Now, lots of other examples in the Achieve report by Plug-in America and Sierra Club, and in the Roadmap report by Drive Electric Tennessee. I just sent that to you, Brian. Hopefully you can get that around to the members of the Climate Council. But one of the best incentives I've ever seen is this one from LADWP. They'll give you a $1,500 rebate for a used EV registered in their service area. The charming black woman is a better messenger than the svelte white folks usually associated with EV ownership. This is an incentive with the low-income resident in mind. Now check the fine print at the bottom of the screen. They have renters in mind here. You don't need to be an LADWP account holder to get the money. Just register it in their service area. I'd love to hear Mike Bullen's comments. I see he's on the call here. An incentive like this can really spur EV adoption in our city and show real leadership. And if the utility provides the incentive, they'll get their money back in a year and a half. Second slide, please. Infrastructure. The previous administration has set us up really nicely to take advantage of a great infrastructure opportunity. Street light and power pole charging. Here's a picture of my Leaf charging up in Watts, California, using a charger on a street light. It works because, like Knoxville, LA changed to LED street lighting, which creates excess capacity on the streetlight circuits, plenty to power chargers like this one. Now, some low-income neighborhoods are characterized as rough. As an anti-vandalism measure, this charger is set 9 feet above the sidewalk. Scan the code on the pole with a smartphone app. The plug descends ready to charge you up. As an incentive, charging and parking could be initially free, especially in areas that have been hard hit by the pandemic. Third slide, please. Now here's a map showing our current state of EV charging infrastructure in Knoxville. This is actually a clear example of structural racism. Abundant charging infrastructure on the west side, including 2 arrays of DC fast chargers shown by those orange buttons. Side where most of our disadvantaged neighbors live. Combine a robust deployment of public chargers in parks, community centers, and church parking lots in East Knoxville with the $1,500 used EV rebate, and we'll reverse.
Did we lose Kent?
I don't hear anything.
Okay. I guess we will move on to the next speaker, given the difficulty that Kent is having potentially with his Wi-Fi. David Green with UTK is up next. David?
Yeah, thank you. Could I have my first slide, please? This slide, I'm sure everyone knows this, it's just a reminder. The plans that we make and what we try to execute will work so much better if the public is behind us. That's really step one. And I think all I'm doing here, everyone knows this, I'm just underlining it. Next slide, please. So I'm talking about energy efficiency. It's not really alternative fuels, but it's a gap that needs to be filled here. According to the Global Energy Assessment, which is to date the most comprehensive assessment of what it takes to create a sustainable global energy system, concluded that the single most important area of action is energy efficiency improvement in all sectors. In the United States, the most effective policy for transportation in reducing greenhouse gas emissions has been our fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards. Since 1975, we've saved 2 trillion gallons of gasoline thanks to these standards. 2 trillion gallons of gasoline is enough to run every light-duty vehicle, passenger car, and light truck in the United States for more than 15 years, every single one. It's more than the total greenhouse gas emissions from the United States for 3 years from all sources. This is a huge, successful program. It's got support from the public consistently for the past 40 years, regardless of party. There's a little more support from Democrats, about 90%, and a little less support from Republicans, about 2/3. But that's quite something in this time. So this is a very successful, public-supported policy. You're going to ask me, my connection is unstable. You're going to ask me what can Knoxville, then I'll come to that. But I want to say now that not only has this reduced greenhouse gas emissions a lot, and this is, by the way, from a Baker Center study that's peer-reviewed and published in Energy Policy. Another Baker Center study, peer-reviewed and published in Energy Policy, showed that every income quintile in the United States saved more on fuel than they spent on increased cost of vehicles due to fuel economy improvements. Every single one. And in fact, as a percent of income, the lower the income quintile, the more they saved as a percent of income. So I think that's very important and a large factor behind the support for this policy. Okay, next slide, please. So what can Knoxville do? Well, the single biggest opportunity for car and light truck greenhouse gas reduction today, right now, is the hybrid vehicle. These data I'm showing here come from the website belonging to the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection Agency, but run out of our backyard in Oak Ridge. Actually, it's in Hardin Valley where these folks are located. It's Oak Ridge National Lab runs this website. And they try to associate, and they do a very good job of it, a hybrid version of a car, make, model, trim level, as close as they can come to the gasoline version. And the average increase in fuel economy for the hybrid vehicles, averaged across 35 makes, models, and configurations, is 50% improvement in fuel economy. That's a 33% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the same car, same functionality, get an immediate 33% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And moreover, the average payback period for those 35 cars is 3.7 years. So this is basically free. So why is the market share 2.3%? Well, I think we understand that too as well. It's a complicated subject, but it basically has to do with lack of understanding. Something like 40% of the public still thinks you have to plug in a hybrid vehicle. Lack of familiarity with the product, aversion to risk of what's still perceived as a new technology, and what behavioral economists call loss aversion. Takes too much trouble to explain it today, but the basic idea is people look at, pay me $1,000 more for a hybrid and get big energy savings in the future. Looks like a risky bet. People tend to decline risky bets even when the payoff is pretty good. So all of that leads to, I think, a tremendous opportunity, one that a local government can accomplish by influencing purchases within its area, and also by its own acquisition policies. And so I think this is something that can be done soon and can be extremely effective. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Turning it over to Jonathan Overly with East Tennessee Clean Fuels Coalition. Jonathan.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. So the way I approached the information I wanted to present to you today is to make sure we were clear on the goal and the audience, first of all, and that is if the goal, as was stated from the Mayor's Climate Council presentation a few weeks ago, as is shown there, is primarily focusing on the Knoxville community, not the Knoxville fleet, but individuals and fleets in the area in Knoxville and Knox County. And so if that's the audience we are trying to go after 2 decades of working with all of the alternative fuels, what we know right now is certainly EVs are growing, and EVs show a great increase in fuel economy and a significant opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So what I'm saying in my suggested approach is that I think the team should develop kind of a robust thought process as a way to talk about, educate, get people in vehicles that are plug-in electrics in the greater community over the coming years, but that we should not only focus on electric vehicles. And the reason for that is we could lose a lot of opportunities for individuals or fleets to make a move that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we only focus on one fuel. So next slide, please. There's a lot of information here. I only want to focus on 2 columns real quickly, but I present this because this is kind of one way to look at each of these fuels and talk about their pros and cons. And the 2 columns I'm going to talk about are the second one, current greenhouse gas savings. And you can see some of those fuels there. I'll real quickly tell you, like CNG and RNG is compressed natural gas, and RNG is the renewable version of that. There's electric in there, separated as light and medium duty. Hybrids are in there, and then there's other fuels. But you can roughly see some of the greenhouse gas emission reductions that can be achieved based on what we know today from those fuels. And actually that 50% from electric is probably a little higher because of the way TVA has been producing electricity lately. But then the second column is the last one, and it's the value of that, because whether it's a fleet or an individual, they consider the costs they're going to have to be able to do something good for the community or see return on investment for themselves. So the reason I highlighted some of those rows, they're the 2 and the 3s for the value of those greenhouse gas reductions. So I can talk more about this slide in future meetings or group discussions or webinars. Last slide, please. So I think we need to have kind of an all-inclusive idea for how we look at communicating to the community outside of just the Knoxville fleet, ways they can become participants in helping reduce greenhouse gas emissions for Knox County. One of the examples of that is Knoxville Utilities Board has a public CNG station. While that may only realize a 10 to 15% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for fleet that choose that, we are very much working right now on the RNG component and the opportunity to offer renewable natural gas to fleets, which could rival or beat the greenhouse gas emissions reduction they could get for electric vehicles. I know I'm about out of time, so I could talk about more of these fuels, but my hope is that the group will keep an open mind to, first of all, making sure they focus on electric vehicle education, both plug-in hybrid and all electric, but then look at a broader set of opportunities that could benefit individuals and fleets to do something where there's just one choice. That's it.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. In the interest of time, we will keep moving on to the transit and transportation demand management presentations. First up, we have also with UTK, Chris Cherry.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Go ahead. I'm going to talk a little bit about big picture for a while, for a minute. So we're going to need these kind of massive reductions in greenhouse gas emissions if transportation is going to contribute to the city's goals up till 2030 and 2050 and beyond. Knoxville's metro, and Jeff will probably talk a little bit about this in a minute, is growing. It's going to continue to grow. Per capita travel demand is growing as well. So you kind of can add up that travel demand and talk about more vehicle miles traveled. Electric grid emission factors are going down. TVA's plan is about 30% reduction in the next few years, but still not going down to zero. And then car emission factors, as Dave Green just mentioned, are going down as well. So these two kind of competing trends are changing, are something we have to think about, and we need bigger steps, I think. Okay, next. So when we think about sustainable transportation, if you remember one thing from what I say, this is the sustainable transport model where we talk about avoid, shift, and improve, okay? This is like reduce, reuse, and recycle, if you think about it that way. Avoid, you avoid unnecessary travel, or you reduce the need to travel. We're all doing that right now, okay? We've avoided a lot of VMT, a lot of greenhouse gases by doing that. If you do travel, you shift to the most environmentally sustainable modes. Here I'm talking about walk, bike, transit, other kind of low impact modes. And then for those who continue to travel by higher impact modes, cars, you improve the efficiency of those cars. If you want to remember this as an acronym, you can add F as in finance, and then it spells out as if. But that's something that you need to remember here. Next. So this is emission factors. Just look at the top group. You got metro, bus, transit, and then you got ride sourcing, private car, and others. Go ahead and push the next slide, please. So the top is well-subscribed transit. The bottom is what we might say is micromobility. This middle is low occupant cars, including EVs. EVs are a lot more efficient than internal combustion cars, but still high emission factors relative to others. And then Ubers, this is taxis, ride sourcing, et cetera, including automated versions. So I would like us to keep in mind that the silver bullets include well-subscribed transit, micromobility, and low occupant cars here, if we must. Okay, next. And so this is a contemporary example to leave you with out of the Compass a couple weeks ago. These are new developments that are within a stone's throw of Gibbs Middle and Elementary School. They don't have walking access, so it's a 2.5 mile drive from these new developments to the school. This is not an as-if type of solution. So I would encourage everybody on the line to think about this, think about the context of safety and all these other equity impacts as we talk about those. So with that, I'm going to hand over the mic, I guess, to Jeff Welch.
Thank you. Jeff? Jeff with us?
Chris ended his presentation just where I need to take off is where the connection between transportation and land use is really critical. He showed the map there of we're building, having developments where the connection is not there between development and generators and attractors and that. And that's basically our zoning over the years. It has been that way over the last 70 years or more. And where we had limited connectivity development, and we've had, as a result, lack of mode choices. Our developments were built around the automobile, and there was no, you could not connect to your neighborhood and through the last 50 years by building cul-de-sacs, subdivisions and that. And as a result, we have increased vehicle miles traveled, we get increased emissions, and then a result of increased miles traveled, then you need to have increased congestion, so you build more roads, so people travel more, and to try to, and that fills up that capacity on the roadway, so you build more roads or widen more roads. So it's a cycle that does not end very well for the community at all. So as a result of that, the city of Knoxville over the last 3 years has developed a new zoning code. And within that zoning code, we tried to break down the barriers of that separated land use. And there were struggles, a lot of discussions through that whole process about, hey, we cannot have mixed use or we cannot have commercial integrated into our residential areas. So we're really struggling in that respect. And we made it through that with a heavy lift on the part of the city administration, the city council, and a number of people to provide opportunities for mixed use in the new code. And we're able to do that along our major corridors to be able to introduce more of a mixed use aspect on those corridors by introducing opportunities for mixed use nodes where it can be integrated into neighborhoods. Obviously, a lot of that is with good design standards, you can make it compatible. i.e., Sequoia Hills has a mixed use right in the heart of Sequoia Hills, where there's some commercial and retail and apartments all within the node there, and it has not torn down the neighborhood as far as and destroyed the neighborhood. In fact, it's is enhanced that neighborhood in some respects. So we need to find ways to continue to do that, and you can do that through good design standards. And you will be able to fight off the not in my backyard type of an attitude. The other aspect that we looked at in the code was to incentivize off-street parking by increasing some density or square footage in exchange for reducing off-street parking available that you have to provide. And I think we need to be able to try to push and encourage that, so it does promote, denser development, but also provides more opportunities for bicycle facilities of that and access to that. Next slide, please. In order to address the two major components of this group was the increased bicycling and walking and transit, we have to have that infrastructure, basic infrastructure in there. And as Chris alluded to, there's very little connectivity between developments with sidewalks over the last 75 years. And our major roads and streets in this area have a lack of sidewalks, or in some places where they do, along Kingston Pike through the Bearden area, you're within 2.5 feet of the travel lane and where traffic's going 45 to 50 miles per hour. Very dangerous situations. So we need to have good design standards in order to incorporate good walking and bicycle facilities through the city. The city is doing a good job of requiring sidewalks, but as you move right outside the city limits, you're pretty much done. Knox County does not require sidewalks in any new developments anymore, except within the parental responsibility zones. And even there's a lot of give and take that does not always come out as a win for the residents in the area and those folks that do want to walk or drive a vehicle. So we need summary, we need to have good mixed use development, and we also have the basic infrastructure needs to be applied as early in the development process or in conjunction with the development process. So I think I'm probably about done with my time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff. Up next is Belinda Woodall-Brill with KAT.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk transit in 3 minutes. Let's see if I can do it. Okay, overview. CAT is the City of Knoxville's transit system. We have funding from the city, the state, and the federal government, as well as our fares. We operate specifically within the City of Knoxville. In non-pandemic times, our ridership is about 250,000 passenger trips a month. And over the past 5 years, we've been improving frequency on routes and providing later evening service on many routes. We have 15-minute service on 3 major corridors during peak hours. And our passengers at this point are predominantly low income, and most trips are to work or school. So the challenge of transit, next slide. Transit systems have to balance good transit service, like really good frequency and later hours of service days, with how far into the community we go. And this gets into land use that we've been talking about. This slide illustrates the point. The left side shows a focus on good transit service along major corridors, while the slide on the right focuses on reaching lots of places, but you'd have infrequent transit service. So these two scenarios cost the same. It's just a matter of how you balance those two goals. So land use is intricately tied with how successful and how expensive transit service is. This fairly dramatic slide shows the cities of Atlanta and Barcelona. Similar populations, but different development patterns, obviously. It would cost an estimated $500 billion to provide transit service levels in Atlanta that are comparable to Barcelona's $20 billion investment. So in Knoxville, as we've been saying, residents keep moving further outside the city, and the jobs do as well. And so to serve these new locations means less opportunity for frequent service in the urban core. So think Emory Road at I-75 or even Turkey Creek. Reaching those expands and uses a lot of resources. So we could try to go everywhere with poor transit service, but with CAT, we try to focus on providing quality transit service within the urban core instead. Plus, as I think Jeff mentioned, areas further out lack necessary infrastructure like sidewalks to make transit feasible. So why is transit important? This is, what I have to, this is my spiel. Next slide. Of course, we know in the US, transportation is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and our transportation system is the most energy intensive in the world, and that is continuing to increase in contrast to other developed countries, and that's not all clean energy. So while electric vehicles can be part of the solution, many people cannot afford new electric vehicles. And of course, not everyone is able to drive. Think seniors, teens, and many prefer not to. Transit is the great equalizer. Consider that even older used cars can cost a low-income family a large portion of household income, while transit can provide up to $10,000 in savings annually. That's a big chunk of change for somebody who works minimum wage. Also, this slide shows it's a matter of geography. The amount we're driving and the number of cars and trucks on the roads means expanded roads or more congestion and more time and energy lost in traffic and greater costs. So creating complete streets with mixed use and higher density provides opportunities for transit to be successful. Central Avenue is a great example of that. You have busier corridors with walkable surrounding neighborhoods, senior living, neighborhood pubs, and really building from the core of Knoxville outward. And we see a lot of success with that as far as transit, walkability, bikeability. So those complete street designs are pretty crucial to success, as well as that increased density and the land use issues. So that's me, done.
Thank you very much. Speaking of bicycles and pedestrians, we'll move on to the last section of panel presentations, hearing from Ellen Zaviska and Caroline Cooley. So I believe, Ellen, you are up first.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity. And I was really heartened to see this element, this strategy of getting more people using active modes of transportation come out at the top of the survey, because the key point I really want to make for you today in this limited time is that this is doable. We can, starting today, we can take actions that will help people get out of their cars, help them walk and bike more, and help them use public transportation more. And this allows Knoxville residents not only to lead healthier lives and have greater access to opportunities around them, but then also to reduce those emissions from vehicles. We know this approach works because other cities have done it. And this is a chart showing, for example, the growth in bicycling in a handful of US cities over the last 10 years. Now, these are places that have invested in safer streets. They're working to change the culture around transportation, and they're seeing results. And in terms of how you do that, that's a much bigger question than we can get into in this moment. I just want to make sure, as I said, that you know that it's doable. And this is something that, of course, costs money, but it doesn't have to break the bank. Next slide, please. And it's something we can incorporate into other projects and studies. And this is just some images from some low-cost retrofits in one of those cities we looked at in New Orleans. You can click forward a couple times just to see these before and afters on these low-cost retrofits. And we have, of course, so this is all about designing streets for better speeds and posting safer streets and designing in this low-cost infrastructure. And I think there's one more example if you want to click through. This is another before and another after. And of course, we have great examples here in Knoxville. Belinda already mentioned Central. Cumberland Avenue is a great example. That wasn't a low-cost retrofit, but it was incredibly meaningful in terms of the safety of that street. So we've looked at the crash data on Cumberland, and since that retrofit, we saw a 90% drop in traffic crashes involving people walking and cycling on Cumberland, 90%. We also saw for all crash types on Cumberland about a 45% drop in crashes. So it increases safety across the board to make these sorts of retrofits. And the next slide, please. So here's an example from Knoxville of a low-cost retrofit. This one's pretty new. You may not have seen it. One more click to see the after. This is the installation of what's called a Hawk pedestrian beacon. over near the soccer complex on Dale Avenue. And again, this is just one example, but creating these safer street crossings, whether it's with signals and beacons like this, with refuge islands, with curb extensions, or whatever combination, that's really essential to this. People aren't going to consider leaving their car at home, walking to the store, or taking the bus to work if they just don't feel confident that they can cross the street safely to get to their destination. And just to be clear, again, this isn't about retrofitting every single street in Knoxville. We have the data on which streets pose the most risk. So it's about focusing on our high crash arterials. One more click, please. And these are the streets where we see nearly 40% of traffic fatalities involving people walking or cycling are on these handful of high crash arterials in the city. And when we focus on these streets, we can make a big difference in safety and comfort and actually getting people out of their cars and choosing another mode. So Caroline Cooley from Bike Walk Knoxville is going to talk more about that, and thank you.
Thank you. Caroline, are you ready?
I hope so. Yes. Hi there, I'm Caroline Cooley. I'm the president of Bike Walk Knoxville, which is a local nonprofit. And I'm going to talk about how to make walking and biking less dangerous. But first, are walking and biking more dangerous than driving? I think we've already seen data from Ellen Zaviska's presentation that does document that that is so. But just to give you a big picture, nearly 100 people die on the roadways in the United States every day, and more than 6,500 are injured. Motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of death for people aged between 16 and 24 years, and the second leading cause for children ages 4 to 15 years. It's 11 times more likely for a pedestrian or bicyclist to be killed in a traffic crash compared to a motorist. So yes, walking and biking are more dangerous than driving. Next slide, please. So how do we improve this? We can do this through what is called Vision Zero. The goal of Vision Zero is 0 traffic deaths and serious injuries. The traditional approach to traffic safety has been that traffic deaths are inevitable. We assume that humans behave perfectly when they are out on the roadways. The primary goal has been to prevent collisions. And it is, again, assumes that people drive responsibly or walk and even bike responsibly, which sometimes they don't do. And that saving lives is too expensive. Now, Vision Zero approach is that traffic deaths are preventable, that we can integrate human failing in the approach, that the primary focus should be on preventing fatal and severe crashes. It should be a systems approach that is data-driven with measurable outcomes. And saving lives is not expensive. Next slide. So how do we achieve Vision Zero? It's important that it's understood that it's not a simple program. It's a philosophy that has to be throughout government and planning commissions and every decision maker within the community. It requires political commitment from the highest elected official, which is our mayor. And then through that leadership, we involve all the government. It involves all the government departments. A task force is developed that includes government department staff and community stakeholders that must be diverse and inclusive. It is then, they then develop an action plan that is a data-driven approach. It's very important that we have diverse community involvement from multiple sectors so that there's an equity and engagement from neighborhoods and especially communities where they already have the highest incidences of injuries and deaths from traffic crashes, especially pedestrians and bicyclists. And we should prioritize people, not cars, in road design and in speeds on those roadways. Some example strategies include lowering the speed limits on arterials to a maximum of 35 miles per hour and allowing neighborhoods to have a 20 mile per hour speed limit, which is not allowed in Knoxville right now. 5-lane cross sections could be prohibited, as they are very wide streets that are very dangerous for pedestrians to get across, and they also increase traffic, actually increase crashes. These are policy decisions and do not require funding, but they do require political support. And as Ellen already pointed out, we know where the high crash, injury, and death locations are, so we need to prioritize improvements in those areas that will help decrease crashes and especially injuries and deaths of the pedestrians and bicyclists. And as mentioned by Jeff, we need to address the barriers for walking and biking to school. And this is through land use and development, and also maybe even simple solutions such as connecting cul-de-sacs with even simple natural type. They don't have to necessarily be concrete sidewalks, but just find the way to get the kids to school without having to get in a car and drive 2.5 miles when they live 200 yards from the school. Next slide. And so Vision Zero strategies result in fewer greenhouse gas emissions. If we can increase cycling and walking through improving the safety of biking and walking, we will see that there's reduced vehicle travel, and this will result in reduced emissions and air pollution and fewer crashes, fatalities. And this creates a safer, healthier environment for all. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. We were going to hold this time for questions. We are tracking a little behind schedule, so I thought we would turn it over to Brian to wrap up this panel session, and then we'll head into our facilitated discussion. Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I hate to monopolize this time with you having to listen to me talk again. I'm looking forward to more discussion in the latter half, and that's one of the reasons that we wanted to reserve this time and try to get caught up so we could get more into the facilitated discussion, which is, I know, what you're most excited about as well. I just wanted to reiterate that these panels were designed based off survey results. This is your input, your comments, your questions, and our staff getting with the technical experts to start bringing this information. I thought it was important to bookend any sort of discussion with, on the front end, making sure that you're hearing from the technical experts before we have a discussion. And then we can capture your feedback and take that into the working group discussions and be able to add a little bit more depth there. If you're interested in the depth of conversation, those working group meetings we've said are optional for the 15-person climate council, but you're welcome to attend. I know that some of you have staff that specialize in discussing these topically. They're working on projects that relate to these sorts of topics. If you'd like to send your staff member and have them involved, we can add them to that working group in lieu of having you. Just contact me and we'll work out the logistics and make sure they're up to speed. That meeting will be on August 11th. So if you're loving this and you want to sit down and you want to discuss it in more depth and help really start trying to craft that language and concerns and how we evaluate and prioritize these strategies that really reflect the great work that's happening. I mean, that's what you're hearing from the panels, the great work that's already happening here in the community. But how do we amplify that? How do we make sure that the city's in a better position to act on some of these and make sure that we've got our hands on the right levers? So I'll turn it back over to Luke. I know that we've got a lively facilitated discussion planned for the latter half of the meeting. And thanks again to all the panelists. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your patience trying to throw together these 3 minutes of talking. I know that you've got a lifetime of experience that you could probably share today. Unfortunately, we made you whittle it down to the most relevant points based off survey feedback.
Thank you, Brian.
Luke, you're muted.
Let's take a 1 to 2 minute break and then we will circle back up to start the facilitated discussion. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again to our presenters. And we will roll into the facilitated discussion part of today's meeting. And as with any discussion, especially one that's having to take place virtually, we just wanted to set a couple of ground rules. I think everyone knows we're all adults and professionals, so just ask that we be respectful of each other's opinions and thoughts. Given the time constraints that we're under with being a little behind schedule, we're going to limit discussion strictly to GHG mitigation strategies for transportation. And in terms of objectives, we're to the point that Brian just made, really looking to kind of identify points of leverage for each strategy, both in terms of what the city can tackle versus what private sector investment is most suitable to undertake. Are there any questions before we get started? In terms of folks trying to speak, I've got you all up, I think, in my grid. There should be a raise your hand feature. If you are trying to ask a question and you're having difficulty being called upon, you can also just wave and we'll try to get to you that way as well. I've also seen some thoughts being exchanged in the chat feature as well. That might be one way that you all can try to have your inputs captured. If we run out of time here, we aren't able to discuss it. So without further ado, we will jump in and to refresh your memory, since it's been a minute. These are, again, the list of strategies. I'm sorry, my computer is a little sensitive today. These are the strategies on the right-hand side and your responses to them, somewhat aggregated in terms of the top level, where you all felt that there was a high level of importance, moving down to the middle section in yellow, and then of course the ones in orange being marked less important. So where I wanted to start with this group was just to get some general reactions, and you can see some prompt questions that we have. What stands out to you about these results based on what you've heard today from our panelists or since the last meeting? Has your viewpoint changed, and why? And is there anything that's missing from this list that the group should be considering? For example, or in other words, are there any new strategies that should be considered? Is there anyone who wants to dive in? If not, I'm not averse to calling on people. Mayor.
Yeah. First, I think in the green sections, the bicycle and pedestrian facilities, I think the word safety, convenience, and connectivity, but particularly safety, because I'm thinking about, first of all, I totally endorse the Vision Zero philosophy and embrace it, and am ready to get advice from this council on how we move forward with that. But I think to the extent that I also know that people are change averse and sometimes only see what's being taken away rather than what's being added. Even something simple, people have suggested that we close Gay Street to traffic during the pandemic to have more space, reclaim space from cars for people to be outside. And at many people think that's a good idea, but other people are like, we will lose the curbside pickup. We will lose this car convenience, that car convenience, very car centric, and not seeing the gain. So to the extent that the safety stuff in particular, I can't remember, maybe it was Ellen's slide talked about the 5 or 6 corridors where we have the most pedestrian and bicycle fatalities or injuries. how that's changed on Cumberland, but how can we change it on Chapman Highway, on Broadway, on whatever the other, Kingston Pike. I think those are ways to sell it, because there's the right thing to do policy-wise and technical-wise, but I got to worry about selling it as well. And I don't mind expending political capital on these and budget, but getting the politics right is important too. The other thing on the equity thing, as far as, I just thought it was an interesting thing that someone mentioned, that people are driving in very expensive cars that cost a lot, a fair amount to maintain and insure, to food pantries. And so that's where, when you have to own a car to go to a food pantry. And so when we talk about public transit investments, and again, I think Belinda raised some really good points about the trade-offs between frequency of service in the urban core. I hope that we can make those things, the quality of life and the ability to walk and take transit and bike in the urban core, so good that people will want to move here. And they'll say that, but then how do we also avoid the thing that happens with transit-oriented developments, that it's super expensive? So the affordability part. Anyhow, those are some of my reflections based on some of the presentations we heard. So thank you very much. And I'll mute myself and listen to more conversation.
Hey, Luke.
Yes.
I'll jump in. This is Jonathan. I'll just real quickly say that I'm very happy to see that the two that landed in the green are those two, because I think it's incredibly important that we have bikeable, walkable, and accessible, nice mass transit serving all of the greater area. Those tend to take a little bit longer to develop, but you have to start as soon as possible making those plans. And I could probably talk to Belinda for an entire day and hear about ideas they have on mass transit, Ellen on bicycle programs. But some of what's in the yellow, or the middle, if that's not yellow for some reason because I'm colorblind, are the things we might be able to do more quickly. So I'll just finish my comment by saying that, per my notes earlier, I think when we look at fleet operators, I think that needs to be expanded to not just electric vehicles, but all of the fuels, unless we miss some opportunities.
That's great feedback. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, this is George Wallace. I'll jump in there with a comment. I'll dovetail what Jonathan said. It's really expensive to expand and improve bicycle facilities. It's not always politically easy. I mean, Cumberland Avenue, we took a lot of grief and we spent a lot of political capital doing Cumberland Avenue, and I love the results. I'm glad to see that. That's what a lot of us thought would happen, but there's still a lot of people that are really upset about the way Cumberland Avenue functions, and they're not happy with it. And so those are hard. And public transit, I mean, I hear what you're saying on public transit, but KCDC's finishing up a project right now off of Western that had for low income and for folks with some disabilities, and yet it's all car. It's all vehicle supported. CAT's not supporting, that new development. And I mean, it's really kind of we believe in it, we think it ought to happen, and yet we're doing developments in our city that we're not even adhering to these own strategies. And these are brand new developments. I think the yellow gives you a lot more opportunity to work on a broader scale and creating public. How can we do more, convert more electric vehicles, and how can we have more charging infrastructure and partnering with fleet operators? I think there's probably more to gain in the yellow than it's probably not as politically challenging as the green. I mean, it's so expensive. I think we spend a lot. We spent a lot of time on council on changing the zoning, and yet we met with resistance every turn on that. And yet people say they want, they want multifamily development on the corridors, and yet we fought and we've got to fight and push back every stretch of the way on that. So these are really hard, and they're not always popular decisions. They may be popular to the people on this call, but they're not popular, crossways when you get into the cost of it and some of the challenges and the consequences that come with it. But I'm a novice. I'm not in this. I'm a business guy, but I see opportunities more in the yellow than in the green. But it's very interesting discussion. I need to learn more. I need to do the deeper dive and understand exactly. There were a couple of graphs on there about how to, the impact of each. I thought that was very interesting. It just went so fast I couldn't keep up with it.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's my comments.
Well, hopefully we just sold your participation at the August 11th meeting.
Yeah, hope so. I'd like to. If I can, I will. So.
Thank you. Any other general reactions? I think George just touched a little bit, and Jonathan as well, and even the mayor touched on some challenges and some opportunities, and we will hold space for that over the next couple of slides. But want to get any other general reactions? Yes, Ellen.
Thanks, Luke. I just wanted to respond to the point that George was making about the cost. And I understand an example like Cumberland was very costly, both financially and politically. And getting through that zoning, the recode fight, what was a long and arduous task, and the city did a fantastic job. The reason I wanted to show the examples I did of retrofits is that there are a lot of low cost options. There really are. And I only, I had 3 minutes, so I couldn't talk about every single possibility, but we know that physically separated places to ride bicycles is what gets people even considering the possibility of bike commuting who never would. And you can do that with flex posts and curbs and the city. There's examples all over the country and all over the world. And in terms of those intersections where we know people are getting hit, you can do that with changing signal timing, which is zero cost except for staff time. You can do that with, again, flex posts and curbs and paint as a starting point without having to rebuild an entire intersection. So, and it certainly, of course, it takes political capital because, if someone has to slow to 5 miles an hour to make a right turn instead of whipping around at 20 like they're used to, they might make an angry call to their city council member or the mayor's office, and I totally get that. So there is an engagement process with that too. You can't just drop it on the ground. But like I said, it doesn't have to break the bank, and we know where the hazards are. And I think if we take a systematic approach, we can start to chisel away at them. Thanks.
Thank you. See a couple hands raised. Is it Alicia or Alicia?
Yeah, it's Alicia. But something I heard a lot, just kind of briefly mentioned, was like an increase of the education regarding like electric vehicles. And I think specifically targeting education towards, I guess, car dealers. I saw some research on that when I was preparing for this, that car dealers don't often know about what national or federal or even local incentives there may be offered for electric vehicles. And so like informing consumers in that way is just missing. There's a missing link there. And something else that I was thinking about was there have been some cities that have implemented like a kind of public-private ride sharing potential. And that's not something that I really heard a lot about today, but it was kind of interesting. And I thought that maybe it would be an interesting opportunity just to add on.
Great, thank you. I see Stephen raised his hand, and then we'll go, after Stephen, we'll go to Stan.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation. Thanks, everybody. I'm curious, and I apologize if I missed it, but it would seem to be extremely helpful if we tried to take these broad areas here, the various topics, and at least attempt, and I know it's not going to be perfectly quantifiable, but we should at least try to quantify the carbon reduction associated with each of these, what we think, based on some level of implementation, what they would look like, have cost expectation for kind of where they rank from a cost perspective, and then maybe some metric on sort of where we think at least, and again, this would be something to be debated a little bit, what the political costs are associated with these, because there's a lot of wonderful things here, and I love to bike, I love to do all these things, and I think they're phenomenal. There's a lot of really interesting ways that we can do various things, but I'd like to try to quantify so we don't lose perspective on the carbon reductions associated with each of them, the cost associated with each of them, and then the sort of political capital cost, the opportunity cost there. Is there any way that we can get each of these assigned at least an attempt at each of those metrics?
Brian, I'm going to point
Let me jump in here real quick. Yeah, thanks, Luke. So yes, Stephen, on the working group level, that's what we're going to be working on. And obviously, these are still very vague language, and while we'll tighten up the language, this is the start of a conversation, and it's not a perfectly defined project. So we're going to talk about a range, but it's going to be a relative range of mitigation impact of pursuing these. We have access to some of the data that USDN had, and we'll also be tapping into some local expertise to figure out what would be the biggest bang for the buck. So we'll be looking at relative cost as well as relative mitigation impact at the working group level. That's one of the deliverables coming out there.
Okay. All I ask is because it would be very helpful to make sure that the underlying assumptions that lead to whatever those, determinative costs are transparent to everybody, because obviously I've already heard some things about EVs that I think are, different perspectives people have about them that may not be actually sort of totally grounded in what we're seeing in the marketplace and how quickly some of the adoption is going and how fast that's projected to come. So it would be very valuable to make sure that all the assumptions associated with building up those end results are transparent to everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And I also ask for your patience because we're not coming out of this with specific, like ready to fund projects. So we're going to have to accept some level of relativity in impact and cost there.
Thank you, Brian and Stephen. Stan, welcome to the meeting. We're glad you were able to patch in.
Man, thank you. Look, my question really is, I like doing studies of other cities, and I hear how much money it costs, and I hear how much political capital is going to cost. Has anybody else done this that you know of to really look at climate reduction based on how the streetscapes are and how the buses are and all that kind of stuff? Has anybody done this yet?
The strategies that you're looking at here, Stan, there are some assumptions that USDN had for them to do evaluation. So we'll pull from those assumptions, and we'll be as forthright as we can about any sort of limitations that we may see whenever we present those, and need to define them if we want to be more specific. But yeah, there are numbers behind the strategies that are listed here. Anything that we add would be missing that data, obviously.
Well, but I think the other important point is that's why we have the technical working groups, because a lot of Jeff and Jonathan, you guys have, and many other people on the call, Chris, David, you guys have really been in the industry, and you can point us toward those other very good sources of information. So, again, I think to Brian's point, that's the level of granularity that we really want to unpack with our technical working groups. And I appreciate, George, your comment around the political sensitivities, because again, that's really, that is an important consideration, Stephen, to your point, and that's really a lens that I think this group offers, that the technical working group then can really focus in on some of those more technical elements like cost and mitigation impact.
And also, when I think of the hood and the low income folks around here, a lot of that study stuff, I had no idea about Kingston Pike had 90% lower casualties or accidents. That's great information. Like, we're just doing Magnolia area right now, or I think we might have been finished. We might just been done with it. Like, did that help? How does that work? How do we do that study? And how does low income people get this information? Is my other question.
We can that's a good question. I think we can pin that one.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm good. I just want to make sure that we're, again, the only reason why I'm joining this call is to make sure that the low income community is represented and to make sure that we're also talking about equity, right? Like they're going to need more help in this process than a Kingston Pike. I mean, I know it costs a lot to do Kingston Pike, but there's going to be a lot more stuff that we're going to need to be able to push through. You know, the bus time is going to be great, but not a lot of people bike. So we need some education on that. You know, a lot of people do walk. We're going to need some more connectivity. So those are the kind of things that I'm concerned about.
Thank you. Any other general reactions before we move on?
Yeah, if I might.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think we need to realize that this goal of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is an extremely challenging goal. And as I recall, there's a 2030 goal as well. But that's an extremely challenging goal that requires a systematic transformation, mostly of how we use energy. It's a huge challenge. And we are going to need all of these good ideas. But I think I can't emphasize enough that the first step is to bring the public along. We all know this. We all understand the importance of addressing climate change. The folks out there don't all agree on this, not yet anyway. And it's going to be really hard to do until they are on board. And that is something that I'm not saying Knoxville can do this all by itself, but it's something that Knoxville can take on and intentionally try to accomplish. That's my first point. Now, I said we need all these good ideas. I didn't hear any idea I didn't like here. But the studies that have quantified what the impacts are say that you cannot do this without greatly improving energy efficiency, and then that won't get you even halfway to where you want to be. You need to have low carbon energy for transportation. And that means electric vehicles, and we didn't mention hydrogen, but we should not lose sight of hydrogen. It's the second mover. It's way behind, but the technology has improved dramatically. There are more than 2,000 hydrogen fuel cell buses operating in China today. So it's all of those things you're going to need. And then the question is, you know, where in that does Knoxville have some leverage? Where can we do something? And I think there are, in building the public consensus, should be at the top of the list. Overcoming human and institutional and infrastructure barriers, that should be right at near the top of our list. And then what kind of local incentives can we provide? There are many, many places around the country that have used local incentives to try and help stimulate this market transformation that we need. So that's my comment.
Thank you. All right, in the interest of time, unless there's any other questions or comments around to general reactions to the survey results, we will move into the challenges and barriers section. And I know we've kind of intertwined these a little bit, but here are some of the prompt questions. What resource challenges do we need to consider? Again, I think some of those have been addressed. Where does the investment need to come from? What time parameters should be considered? How should short, medium, and long term be defined? And who are the critical stakeholders? So again, these are related to the strategies to the right. Would love to hear a little more around your thoughts of the challenges and barriers to implementation of these strategies. And I'm getting a message that Brian Han or Han, however you pronounce it, has had your hand up. So Brian, I'm gonna give you the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo earlier what Ellen said about the infrastructure for bicycle and pedestrian facilities. I know what George was saying, there's a lot of cost associated with that at times. However, there are many places in the city that could use just some paint and plastic, really, and some signal timing and whatnot. And I think that has to be factored in into what Steven said in terms of just, quantifying things. You got to remember too that if somebody rides their bike to work, they're less likely to make that secondary trip after work to go, run to the store or pick something up that's unnecessary. And it kind of changes. It's just a real culture shift when you have that ease of mobility, walking and biking. And then, but yes, quantifying these things, even if it was just a scale of 1 to 5, would be super helpful for some of us that aren't as versed in greenhouse gas reduction policies. But that's all I had.
Thank you.
Can I chime in with maybe a build-on question to the point you made about investment? I'm really interested in hearing perspective from this group around how you view and how you might interpret the city's role in some of these. We historically build infrastructure, that's what we do, and we historically provide transit, that's what we do. I'm really interested, especially in these yellow categories around electric vehicles and charging and whatnot. I'd love to hear perspective around whether you all feel this is a role of the city or whether this is an area for partnership. Luke's waving at me.
And Aaron, can I point that to Kent, who was cut off from his presentation due to Wi-Fi issues, and I think he was about to touch on infrastructure or lack thereof in the eastern part of the city. So Kent, I want to give you the opportunity to respond to that. One is a response, and two is a way to close the loop on your particular presentation.
Yeah, thanks. I wasn't quite sure where I got cut off, but my last slide there showed all the electric car chargers in town. It basically was a screenshot from the PlugShare app, and it showed that there's plenty of car charging infrastructure on the west side, and there's none on the east side. And one thing I was suggesting is just put some car charging infrastructure where lower income people live, and combine it, if we can, with that $1,500 rebate. That would be a utility funded rebate, but I think it's practical for the utility. Again, I said I wanted to maybe hear from Mike Bowen if he's still on the call with us. But that would be a powerful incentive for low income people to adopt electric vehicles. And it would also kind of balance the infrastructure. Also, one little thing, why not put a battery of car chargers at the zoo? There's plenty of room in their parking lot there. People can get off the freeway. Long distance electric vehicle traffic would be served by that. And the zoo is also close to a lot of low income neighbors who could use that if they couldn't get a car charger at home.
Thank you. Any other thoughts around?
Luke, this is Jonathan. Let me tag on to Kent's comments.
Please.
So I think to Kent's point, an appropriate group of people need to come together and make an EVSE plan for greater Knoxville. It's just one thing that needs to happen, both light duty and DC fast charge. And the more we have community input from people from limited income areas as well as others, and try to look at where all that could go, then we can kind of dream big and then figure out how we might be able to get to that point. But the other quick thing I want to point out, though, is that there are 2 to 3 significant sized funding sources coming that if such a group tried to make a plan for places where additional DC fast chargers could be placed in and around Knoxville that are within 5 miles of a corridor, we might be able to dream of a way to have, 6 more of those along I-75 and 40 that are within 5 miles of the interstate, and in 5 years have all of those in place. So that includes VW funding and some other federal funding that's coming down the pike, but that's one thing that could take care of the investment part or help with it.
Yeah, and can I respond to some? Aaron was asking what's the role of the city, and I think obviously that's a multifaceted question. You have the ability of the mayor, and I know she's generally willing to do this, but get her the right talking points to use the bully pulpit to really articulate some of these elements. I'm in complete agreement with what Jonathan just said. I think that the electrification, while there are other strategies out there, there's clearly an enormous amount of momentum in that direction, and that technology is alive and well in our area. I mean, all you have to do is go back and look at the World's Fair, you know, and sort of the energy aspects of that, but the electrification piece of this, I believe that, you know, based both of what the city can do from structuring a narrative to pulling together working groups and then actually being able to go after some of these funding sources, both through either, you know, applying for grants or innovative use of borrowing, the city's borrowing, or even structuring long-term leases that allow certain of these things to happen, and combining the narrative with something else. I mean, we've been running a campaign down in Florida on driving on sunshine, which brings both the narrative of renewable energy in with electric vehicles and, you know, combining those types of things. There's ways to put this out in a very positive, proactive, forward-looking vision. And I think using the city's megaphone is a huge opportunity to do that.
Yeah, if I could just build on that, and I think Jonathan's idea about the EVSE plan is really, really important, because there are potential partners here. So in the state of Tennessee, we have Nissan, the first commercial electric vehicle manufacturer making electric vehicles. We now have VW down at Chattanooga, about to become a huge manufacturer of electric vehicles there. We have TVA. We have Oak Ridge National Laboratory. There are lots of partners there who can help and want to help. I think also, having said that, that's really important, and there's a lot of expertise at the university too. But I think that also the politics of this should be worked on, and Knoxville can work on that. Why would the state where all these electric vehicles are being made have no incentives for electric vehicles? And I mean, I know why, I know the answer, but it's a political answer. And that is something that can be worked on, I think. Get together, Nashville, Knoxville, Memphis, Chattanooga, saying, you know, we need this stuff. We need to solve these problems, and we have all these people with jobs making electric vehicles in our state. We have a electricity generation that's important in our state. This is part of our economy, and we should try to get, so I'm gonna sound crazy, we should try to join the other states that have adopted a zero emission vehicle mandate. And then that will make the manufacturers want to sell electric vehicles in our state. There are electric vehicles you can't buy in Tennessee because we don't have a ZEV mandate.
Right. Okay, thank you. Before we transition over to opportunities, I wanted to ask about the question around time parameters, so that the working group has a sense of where you all are thinking bigger picture and strategically around what should be considered, you know, how short, medium, and long term would be defined. And I wanted to get some folks' inputs on that. Anybody?
Hey, Luke, this is Rebecca. So I'll jump in with an answer to that question so that I can comment on what David just said too. But I think clearly some of this goes back to what are the impacts on carbon and how does that match up with the mayor's goals, and clearly aligning that so we have those short-term, medium, and long-term. But I think part of the political, and I think David made a great point on the political point, and I'll say I spent a lot of time talking to sustainability officers around the larger cities in the Valley, and there's a lot of concern about the politics, right? And so, but places like the larger cities seem to be where we can make the most play. But I didn't know if anybody had any specific polling data as far as Knoxville goes on kind of any of these strategies, or the ones that might be more palatable. That's not exactly how you should build policy, but I certainly understand what George was talking about about trying to get some of these things done. So I didn't know, I know Luke, Brian, I might be putting you on the spot. I didn't know if we had any of that or if we've seen any of that for Knoxville that we could build on here. And to David's point, maybe build that campaign on what's already kind of building momentum in the city.
There are definitely, so at this level, we hadn't planned to get into as much technical discussion as we have today. There are some, obviously Drive Electric Tennessee has already done some, public polling to kind of figure out what some of those moving mechanisms and perceptions are. So some of that has occurred. In regards to these specific strategies that you all have surveyed, no, we haven't. So I think that there's a lot, and your comments kind of encapsulated this for me, but there's a lot of refinement that needs to happen about where do we really feel like we want to generate that energy. And I think a lot of this is coming through in the conversation today. How do we need to tweak language and priorities and define those before we go out and get too much of a pulse check. So, whenever we talk, as an example, whenever we talk about public transit investments that significantly enhance coverage, service quality, frequency, and/or speed, that's a lot to unpack. What are we really prioritizing, and what do we need to discuss to prioritize before we send that out? So I've wanted to get the technical expertise and your all's expertise as well before we take it public. Is that fair? And feel free to challenge me on that or question me on that. I'll mute myself and be open ears.
I'll just jump back in and say, I think that's very fair. I think the comments made here today have made me recognize how big of a political, you have to work through the politics. And so I do think, I agree that we need some refinement here, but if we could find those couple of things that folks are most excited about, and we could get some wins and show that momentum, I think then you build a community that can rally around where you want to head. And so, but I certainly agree, we may not be there yet to see how these play in the public field, so.
Yeah, and I think an important perspective is we've got, a set number of strategies here, but we may find a need to bifurcate some of those and focus on different priorities, even as a subset of that same strategy as a part of this process. So that kind of broadens things, and some of these we'll want to jump on earlier, and some of these will be longer term. I mean, like AVs, for instance, what are we actively ready to do in regards to autonomous vehicles, even if that was a top 2 priority when the market's not even ready?
I'll jump in with an example. A few years ago, we had a landscape contractor that did work for the city convert his mowers. A very simple thing. He converted his mowers to propane gas. And it was probably a very insignificant impact on the carbon, but it did challenge, and I think he got some incentives to do that. I think he got a lot of publicity off of that. He challenged other companies to convert their mowers as well. And that's when I look at what kind of incentives can you give someone to convert their delivery vehicles to electric. I mean, those are the kind of things that I think about. It was very simple and made a big impact, still having an impact today and challenging people to have, to look for that. So I think that's where the city partnered with them, and they did it. And I think they make that a requirement, or maybe at one time maybe they were making that a requirement to bid, or giving preferential treatment on the bid process, because he was using propane. So I think there's opportunities like that to incentivize people to, in this, they become very visible, and people, are encouraged by that in some way to do their own, in their own private life. So it's just one small example.
This is Jonathan. Let me jump in and say one more thing, and then I want to try to answer the question about short, medium, long term. But to George's point, that's focused on diesel vehicles, but I certainly want to ask you, Brian, and Aaron and Mayor. TDEC is expected to come out with the VW Class 7 through 8 funding that is going to prioritize cleaner vehicles that could include electric, CNG, propane. It will prioritize those over new diesels. and fleets, public fleets in Knox County and several surrounding counties could get up to 75% of the cost of the new vehicles covered by that grant. They could request that much. Private entities can only get 25%, but in most cases that covers the new incremental cost for like a propane or a CNG vehicle. Electric vehicles, if you're talking medium and heavy duty used, it does not cover all of the cost. But just in terms of trying to help propel the message that the funding is out there so we can get people to ask questions and see what else other people have done and try to see if we can help them apply. I need to follow up with you, Brian, and see how your office may be able to help us propel the opportunity.
I think that'd be a great idea, Jonathan, and I'll let you work with Brian on the details. But the other thing I'll mention, because we have so many, and this is the type of kind of collaboration conversation I think we want to have, is that UT and KUB and TVA, you know, there's a lot of us, kind of what I call the institutional partners, who also have similar types of fleets. And so, again, whether it's just the city and the few trucks that might be up for replacement within the time frame they're looking at, but it's always about thinking about how we push that even further beyond just local government, and how do we leverage that corral operation to make sure that we're all taking advantage as best we can of those opportunities, especially when it comes with money, because it's always easier to pay for it when someone else is writing the check.
And my whole request is not really to push the city, it's to help the city tell others that the opportunity's there. But to answer that question real quickly, and then I'll stop. I think short term is 3 to 5 years, medium term is 10 to 12 years, and long term is 20 years.
Thank you, Jonathan. Alicia, you had your hand raised. Wanted to give you the opportunity to speak. And you may have noticed I've moved the slide into opportunities because I think the conversation is naturally segged into that. But Alicia, if you had a challenge or a barrier or any other thought, go ahead, the floor is yours, and then we'll move to discussion.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about something that Kent had brought up in his presentation, and I think it's really important to keep in mind that just increasing like the accessibility to like EV charging stations in lower income like communities wouldn't inherently increase the opportunities or accessibility to the electric vehicles themselves in those communities. And like keeping that in mind, that those two things have to go hand in hand. So electric vehicle accessibility along with the charging stations, and how we can promote both of those together.
That's a great point. Thank you. Okay, moving into the opportunities, again, there's been some natural overlap in the discussion already, but wanted you to think about any of the specific strategies listed here for which the city currently seems well positioned to take the ball and run with. To Stephen's analogy, where they have the megaphone and can use it. Are there specific strategies here for which the private sector leadership and resources are better or best suited? And are there people on the council who can take a leadership role around that? And then what are the points of leverage for each opportunity? Examples include existing infrastructure, market awareness, community buy-in, or another opportunity that is not listed here. Any thoughts around opportunities and leverage points for these strategies?
Luke, I'll take the first shot at responding to that, if you don't mind.
Don't mind, thank you.
Just to note, again, as I mentioned, we know where the biggest risks are for people walking and cycling, and we want to start tackling those. And we also, the city already has in place, for those who aren't aware, a very strong bicycle network plan. They're currently wrapping up a strategic sidewalk plan for the city. So those are things that don't have to happen to identify, what's the low-hanging fruit in terms of sidewalk gaps. They already have a greenway plan. Where are the gaps? What's the approximate cost of filling them? Where are people facing the most risks when they're using those modes? So that's one where I think there's a lot of opportunity to move forward quickly. Thanks.
if I could say with respect to Jonathan's EVSE plan, I think, you know, at the time that the initial funding for the Reconstruction Act came out, we knew very little about how people charged and where they charged their electric vehicles and where would be a good place and where wouldn't be a good place and whether they needed level 1, 2, 3 or what. And we know a lot now. And I think that in addition to the funding that Jonathan mentioned from the VW settlement, there are also natural partners here who could work with us in the private sector. And Aaron mentioned a bunch of them. I think also VW, Nissan, and many of the manufacturers would, especially those in Tennessee, would be willing to participate in that. They participated in the VW locating of DC fast chargers, which is really very sophisticated. And I think that kind of help is available if we can develop the partnerships and take advantage of it. And this, I think, comes everything from the fact that when I go to the White Street garage and park near the Baker Center, there is no opportunity to charge my electric vehicle whatsoever in that garage. It's not, and in fact, all I would ever need is level 1, just a place to plug it in, because the only thing I would need is if I forgot to charge my electric car and I need to get home. And I can get, in 8 hours, I can get enough electricity to get home. These kinds of things we know a lot about now, data from California, data from a lot of places about how people do these things. We could do a really good plan with the assistance of industry partners who care about it.
Can I, quick
go ahead,
quick question. I know this is focused on the community, but there is obviously an interface between the choices that the city's making, say in electrification. I know there's discussion of electric buses, and I don't know the full extent of the city's fleet as far as both cars and trucks. But obviously, the more that, you know, there's the actual fuel savings relative to cost, but then there's phenomenal maintenance savings because there's virtual no maintenance on electric vehicles. Windshield wipers and tires pretty much is it. And so it's a tremendous opportunity for the city to be saving taxpayers money by electrifying, getting city employees familiar with electric vehicles, which then has a multiplying effect, modeling the electric vehicles through the usage and being able to report out on that as all part of that sort of interface. So I don't know whether there is an internal plan to, you know, try to completely decarbonize the city-owned fleet and then use that as again, a learning platform for spreading the knowledge about encouraging community decarbonization by electrifying the broader community fleet.
Great, thank you. We have rapidly closed in on the 3 o'clock hour in the Eastern time zone. Brian, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Luke. Could we go one more slide ahead as well? Thank you. So I appreciate all your time today. 2 hours flies by. I know that you're all probably, I've gotten several private messages here that everyone had a hard stop at 3. So I appreciate those of you that have stayed on as long as you had. I know that we're all very busy people. The next steps for everyone here is we'll have a transportation working group meeting. The level of technical discussion that we've been diving into, that's going to be the focus of that meeting. There won't be panel presentations. It's a 2-hour block to start hashing through some of these. We'll take the priorities that we heard here and we will re-encapsulate those and deliver them back to you all. Might take a week or so, but we'll target by next Tuesday to get you a write-up of notes, recording a meeting, all the things that we provided you in conclusion to the last meeting. the Transportation Working Group meeting is an optional meeting for Climate Council members. We encourage you all to attend. We hope that you will attend. If you have a staff member, I know some of you have reached out to me that you have staff that really do this. If you want them to attend, just let us know who it is. We'll get them added. We'll make sure that they get all the notices and information that's needed. We're holding a 2-hour block. I have not decided whether or not this will be in person. Maybe that's wishful thinking on my part, but we are reserving webinar channels just in case. I think it would be much more fruitful in person, but I'm not going to put anybody in risk that I wouldn't assume myself. So we're going to assume that it's probably going to have to be online. And one of the follow-up items for those of you that are Climate Council members, you got a customer satisfaction survey to provide feedback on the meeting format, how you felt about the structure. We're open to any sort of feedback there. It's very helpful for us. We shaved a little bit of time off this meeting based off that feedback. And if you have specific comments on the format and the flow of this, we'll take that into consideration for future meetings as well. So be on the lookout for that, probably by next Tuesday as well, whenever we do some of our follow-up items. Luke, if you advance one more, for those of you that need to get a hold of me, and you can't track it down, there's my information. There's where you can find more about our sustainability department. And we also have the Climate Council website. So we'll be updating that. We'll let the Climate Council know when we've got the meeting minutes and the YouTube recording of this up and live if you need to review for any reason. Thank you all. Apologies for running 2 minutes over. If you have any follow-up, just reach out to me directly. I'll be available for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.